Tonight, complete coverage of the death of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, a look at the Pope's visit to Mexico, and the latest on the campaign trail. This is Talking Points. Welcome to Talking Points for Thursday, February 18th, 2016. I'm your host, Alex Amico. To start the show, I'd like to talk a little bit about Justice Antonin Scalia. If you followed politics in the Supreme Court at any time in the last 3 decades, you probably had an opinion on Scalia, and that opinion was probably very strong one way or the other. He was maybe the most polarizing Supreme Court justice in recent memory, the darling of the right and the boogeyman of the left. We'll hear all about his political legacy later, but right now, I'd like to remember a man who engaged constantly in energetic debate, whose best friend on the court was his polar opposite ideologically, and who produced some of the greatest legal writing of a generation. Supreme Court opinions can often be dense, tedious documents that you have to slog through, but not Justice Scalia's. Nino, as his friends and colleagues called him, wrote opinions that were witty, sarcastic, and sometimes even laugh-out-loud funny. He may be the only justice to use jiggery pokery in an opinion, as well as to refer to a majority opinion as pure applesauce. When asked why he wrote it as he did, he had a simple answer. He wanted to make the opinions enjoyable to read, because then someone might read them. Perhaps the most interesting piece of Scalia's personal life is his friendships with fellow Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Elena Kagan. According to former Obama aide David Axelrod, Scalia actually suggested that Kagan be appointed to the court. When she took her place on the bench, the two frequently hunted together. His friendship with Ginsburg spanned the decades they shared on the bench. They and their spouses would spend New Year's Eve together, go to the opera, and their friendship was even the subject of a play. He once said of her, "What's not to like, except her views on the law?" And she of him, "I love him, but sometimes I like to strangle him." Despite their differences of ideology, gender, and religion, they were dear friends. After he died, Ginsburg said that they were best buddies. As I said, you probably have a strong feeling about Justice Scalia one way or another, but regardless of how you feel about him, he served his country on the bench for 3 decades with honor and distinction. He wrote some of the most lively and brilliant legal opinions that will be read for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, he exemplified to all of us that our personal politics should not get in the way of our personal relationships. In a political climate and an election cycle of increasingly bitter and coarse rhetoric, that's a lesson we should all pause to think about. We'll be back.
You know what, guys? There's a lot of tree branches and dry brush over here. We should probably move the bonfire over there. You know what, guys? There's a lot of tree branches and dry brush over here. We should probably move the bonfire over there.
I'm guessing Smokey liked that idea.
Really? Buzz, what's up, man? You left some leaves burning out here.
Yeah, I just just came in just for a second.
Come on, man. If it's too hot to touch, it's too hot to leave. You could torch the whole neighborhood.
It's a good point there, Smokey.
9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by humans.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
The passing of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia leaves a lot of us reflecting upon his life and his 3-decade run on the Supreme Court. Talking Points correspondent Hearns Laguerre Jr. is here to share Justice Scalia's impact as well as his influence.
Although Justice Scalia has passed away, his history remains with us. Scalia was born in Trenton, New Jersey, and grew up as an only child. From childhood, he was an academically bright student. Scalia graduated as valedictorian from Georgetown in 1957 and earned a law degree in 1960. In 1971, he started working for the government as the general counsel of the Office of Telecommunications Policy. A year later, he became the chairman of the Administrative Conference of the United States. In 1974, he was nominated for Assistant Attorney General by President Richard Nixon and was approved by the Senate on August 22, 1974. In 1976, he argued his only case in front of the Supreme Court in Alfred Dunhill of London, Inc. versus Cuba. Fast forward to 1986, and he is nominated to the Supreme Court by President Ronald Reagan. During his last year in presidential office, the Senate approves him by a vote of 98-0, and he is sworn in. Being a part of the Supreme Court for the past 3 decades puts Scalia in a lot of prominent court cases. In 1988, Scalia dissented in the Thompson versus Oklahoma case, which rules that states may not execute people for crimes committed when they were younger than 16 years old. The decision was about a 21-year-old Oklahoma man who was 15 when he helped murder his sister's former husband in 1983. A year later, Scalia ruled in favor of Stanford versus Kentucky. The ruling was 5-4. The case was about the shooting death of 20-year-old Barbell Poor, who was killed by Kevin Stanford when he was 17. The ruling stated that the Constitution permits states to execute murderers who were as young as 16 when they committed the crimes. This helped set clear age guidelines for the death penalty. Recently, in 2015, he dissented on the same-sex marriage ruling in a 5-4 vote. He stated, "If intimacy is a freedom, one would think freedom of intimacy is abridged rather than expanded by marriage." Ask the nearest hippie. Justice Scalia will certainly have an enduring impact on the U.S. court system. Alex, back to you.
Scalia's death has left a lot of controversy as to what will happen to his seat on the Supreme Court. Here to talk about why the open seat is so divisive is Talking Points correspondent Dan Prager. Dan, thanks for joining us. So let's start with the easiest question. Why is there so much controversy over this?
All right. Well, so before Scalia's death, the court balance was 5-4 in favor of conservatives. And with Scalia's passing, this could change hugely for the balance of power in the Supreme Court. If Obama puts up a liberal nominee, it will be 5-4 with liberal justices ruling the bench and having that majority. And if there's not, it's a 4-4 tie, and then I'll get into that later, but a lot of confusing things happen. Republicans, of course, want the seat to stay open until the next election, so they at least have a chance of putting another conservative justice. Well, Democrats are saying that Obama is the president and he should have that right. Mitch McConnell said he wants the Republican Party not to even put up a nominee, not to allow one passed. And Obama said that he will put up a nominee, and this is going to cause a lot of political infighting.
So in this fight right now, where Republicans are virtually all opposed to President Obama nominating someone except for Dean Heller of Nevada, who has the upper hand, politically, constitutionally? Who has the upper hand in this fight?
Well, as far as constitutionally, we're not really sure. Both are right and both are wrong in their own ways. Obama does have a right to put up a nominee, so anyone that says that is clearly wrong. But what Republicans are really trying to argue, and they may not have gotten that message across very well, is that they have every right, as well as put in the Constitution, to reject that nominee. Now, there's not really much precedent for putting up somebody in your final year of office. Republicans say that it hasn't happened in 80 years. Justice Anthony Kennedy was put up in 87, the second to last year in the Reagan administration, and was accepted and approved in 1988. So that's the closest we have. So Republicans did do it. But Democrats did say in 2007 that they would reject a nominee if Bush put one up.
So if we assume that this continues going on and we don't have a nominee until the next president, it's a 4-4 court or an 8-member court, what happens?
So here's where things get a little confusing. In the event of a 4-4 tie, the ruling goes back to the lower courts. There's no real ruling. There's no precedent set. So it really only decides that the lower court ruling was right and only applies to that area that the court was placed in. In a case like Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association, the ruling is going to go toward the union, and the precedent will not be set for the whole nation, just for the California Teachers Association to be put there. But really, politically is where we're going to see a lot of this consequence of not filling the seat, because it's really could be dangerous for Republican candidates if people don't like when the government is shut down, and it could hurt Republicans' chances in 2016 elections congressionally and in the presidential election.
Dan, thank you so much. The United States Supreme Court put a stay on the Clean Power Plan, which will stall climate change legislation from going into effect. The policy would lower carbon emissions by 32% by the year 2030. Talking Points correspondent Shruti Marathe now joins us to look into the Supreme Court actions. Shruti, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So where did the Supreme Court get the authority to put a stay on this power plan?
That's a great question because the Supreme Court has never done something like that. They're definitely doing something new, but they do have the authority to do this because 27 different states were petitioning saying if this legislation goes into place, a lot of companies will be out of business. So they do have the power to put a stay on it until the lower court makes the decision.
And legally, what was their justification for it?
The legal justification goes back to what is said in the Clean Air Act back in the 1970s, and when that was passed, they didn't say anything about the U.S. government controlling carbon emissions, which is why the Supreme Court is saying that we have the authority to say that the federal government doesn't have the authority to regulate this. But again, there's a lot of different legislation that needs to be put under question, not just the Clean Air Act.
Now, on the international level, what kind of an impact is this going to have on the fight against climate change?
It'll definitely be a huge impact. I mean, back in December in Paris, there were a lot of the international community gathered to come up with this climate change regulation. And if the United States does end up rejecting it, then we'll have to go back to the drawing board on how we are going to save our planet.
In the fight for the Clean Power Plan, after this setback, what comes next?
I mean, right now, the U.S. District Court of Appeals is considering it. They're set to hear oral arguments on June 2nd. After that, they'll issue an opinion, and we're definitely going to see it appealed to the Supreme Court, and they'll consider it a couple months later. So it's a long-term decision that we're going to see, but it will probably reach the Supreme Court.
And how does Justice Scalia's death and the opening of his seat on the Supreme Court, how does that affect the landscape of this debate right now?
It has a huge effect on it because the ruling for the stay was 5-4 and Scalia was part of the 5. So if it does come back to the Supreme Court, again, we're going to see a 4-4 split. It all comes down to who gets nominated to the Supreme Court and what way they vote on how this climate change regulation will pan out.
Shruti, thank you as always for your insight. Coming up after the break, details on a new Senate bill to combat the heroin crisis. You're watching Talking Point.
They're coming. Places, everybody.
Light check. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Everything looks good on our end.
And lights.
Come alive with the forest. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Looks like it's done.
Don't let salmonella get funky with your chicken. On average, 1 in 6 Americans will get a foodborne illness this year. You can't see these microbes, but they might be there. So learn the right temperature to cook each type of meat. Keep your family safe at foodsafety.gov.
Pope Francis is back at the Vatican after a 6-day visit to Mexico. Talking Points correspondent Molly Smith joins us now to tell us about the highlights of his trip. Molly?
Thanks, Alex. Pope Francis toured several Mexican cities over the past few days to address immigration issues as well as violence stemming from the country's drug cartels. His 6-day tour culminated yesterday with Mass in Ciudad Juarez, a border city of nearly 1.5 million people that has had a long history of being plagued with drugs and violence and was once considered the murder capital of the world. He offered his blessings to inmates at a local prison and laid flowers at the border to remember the thousands of migrants trying to reach the United States. Let's take a listen to some of what he had to say.
Se vuelve difícil.
It would be difficult to feel rich when we see the loss of friends or of family members to the hands of drug traffickers.
And as if there was no one left to poke at Donald Trump, Pope Francis made some comments of his own. That's right, Pope Francis accused the Republican frontrunner of not being a Christian due to his plans to deport more immigrants and force Mexico to pay for a wall along the U.S. border. The pontiff also announced that he condones the use of contraceptives as a means to prevent the spread of the Zika virus. Alex, back to you.
Thank you, Molly. Within the next week, the Senate will vote on the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, a bipartisan bill aimed at curtailing the heroin and opioid epidemic in many states. Here to discuss the growing problem is Talking Points correspondent Sarah Nevins. Sarah, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome, Alex.
So how has this heroin and opioid epidemic increased in recent years?
So the CDC says that the rate of heroin-related overdose deaths has nearly quadrupled from 2002 to 2013. To put that in perspective, around 11,000 people died from a heroin overdose in 2014, which was a 26% increase from the previous year. And the number of deaths is only rising every single year. So now when most people think of heroin, they think it only affects inner city communities. But the CDC actually saw that the use of heroin has increased most among white suburban Americans. And over the last decade, nearly 90% of first-time heroin users have been white. And they saw the most significant increase in men ages 18 to 25.
And what are some of the factors going into this massive increase? Why is this happening?
So the CDC says that around 75% of addicts were first addicted to prescription drugs. And so they're turning towards heroin because currently a bag of heroin costs less than a pack of cigarettes in the majority of states. And so this is because, according to the USDEA, heroin is inexpensive because there's an increased production in opium and poppy production from Mexican cartels and in Afghanistan. And so it's more affordable and more accessible than most drugs.
And we've seen it's been difficult for heroin addicts to get treatment. Up here in Syracuse at Crouse Hospital, there's a 1-year wait to get into the methadone clinic to treat heroin addiction. Why is it so difficult?
Yeah, so at Crouse Hospital, they're currently treating around 650 people, and about 400 people are on the waiting list. And part of the reason is because it's the only program of its kind in the 17th county surrounding area. So there's not a lot of options. And this also means that people, if they want to get treatment, they have to drive 2 to 3 hours, which is highly impractical. And so there's not a lot of treatment available because there's so many government restrictions. Another form of treatment is Suboxone. And in order to prescribe this, doctors have to have a federal license, and then the federal government can cap the number of people they can treat to 100. And so many doctors, even those who are licensed, are kind of hesitant to prescribe it because it's expensive to get, it takes a long time, and it's hard to get therapy alongside the medical treatment.
And getting back to this Senate bill, will this help? How will this help?
Yeah, so this basically changes the U.S. drug policy from punishment to prevention and treatment. It'll include funding for lifelong treatment, prevention, and recovery efforts at the state and local level. So this will hopefully increase the number of programs like the one at Crouse. And then it'll also include $50 million for intervention programs. So that'll include better monitoring of prescription drugs so they can maybe prevent future addictions. And to ensure that this bill actually gets properly funded and enforced, Senate Democrats want to add on a $600 million finance measure before it gets voted on.
Sarah, thank you so much. World powers have recently agreed to a cessation of hostilities in Syria after talks in Munich, Germany. Here to break down the effects of these developments is Talking Points correspondent Elijah Shama. Elijah, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
You almost called me Max there. So how is this going to affect the conflict in the near future?
Well, in the near future, really what we're seeing is a cessation of hostilities between government-backed forces from Assad and the opposition-backed forces that we're seeing the Saudis back, the Turks back. And really, we're going to start to see humanitarian aid start to go in. This doesn't affect ISIS, however. The war on ISIS is still very much raging, so to speak. And airstrikes will continue on those fronts.
What can we expect the Russians to do regarding this?
Well, Alex, the Russians are really just a key player in this entire situation. We expect the Russians to continue to push for the ending of this ceasefire because in the Russians' best interest to see Assad be fully restored back to power. And Russian airstrikes have largely helped him do that. So they're the reason that Assad is in the position he is in right now at the negotiating table, so it doesn't look like there's going to be any signs of them backing off on their support. They've kind of gone all in on this.
Now there is this ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria. How is this agreement and how is everything that happens after it going to affect that?
Well, in the weeks that follow this agreement, it's going to be very good for the humanitarian crisis in the sense that a lot of these places that haven't necessarily been able to get aid are slowly going to start to see UN aid reach besieged areas like Aleppo and other neighboring cities. In the future, though, this could make the humanitarian crisis much worse because it doesn't look like these sieges are ending anytime soon. This is just kind of a brief respite from that.
And Turkey's been playing an increased role in the conflict. What can we expect them to do following this?
We're going to likely see Turkish involvement step up dramatically. Turkey has seen a fair number of bombings in mainland Turkey. We're talking about Ankara and we're talking about Istanbul, which are major tourist attractions for Turkey. And it really just does not send the message that Turkey is as secure as a lot of people think it is. And being a NATO partner, that's an image that they have to maintain. So we're likely going to see much more Turkish involvement in the weeks that follow.
Can we expect a U.S. policy shift of any sort from this?
If we see U.S. policy shift, it's going to be more involvement from the U.S. and the rescinding of involvement with the YPJ Kurdish group, who Turkey is now starting to shell in response to these recent bombings. But U.S. aid, Senator John McCain recently said that he would very much like to see boots on the ground in Turkey, and that's a very far stance from where Obama has been. But we're likely going to see more Turkish involvement in the more U.S. involvement in the weeks to come.
Elijah, thank you so much. How will candidates fare in the Nevada caucus and South Carolina primary on Saturday? We will break it all down after the break. Don't go anywhere.
If you want to be a parent, it doesn't matter how you play, what you wear, how you dance, or even what direction life takes you. You just need to be there. You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care don't need perfection. They just need you.
So who's going to do what?
I'll pack the dead batteries.
Great.
I'll only put what I don't need into a duffel bag.
Perfect. That's totally unhelpful.
No problem.
Meanwhile, I will try to comfort everyone by speaking in a calm voice. And who is going to handle supplies?
I can forget to do a list for us.
Thanks, pal.
We couldn't be any less prepared. I'm proud of you guys.
Talk to your kids about who to call, where to meet, what to pack. Search Ready Kids at nyc.gov or call 311.
How you doing? My name's Steve. My family's lived in this neighborhood for years. Recently, things got so tight, we had to go to our local food bank for help. I lost a lot of sleep worrying about what the neighbors might think. That is until I saw them there, too. How'd I do, Steve?
A little stiff. You could have done a little better.
What? Come on. You know, I have an Academy Award.
Yeah, but not for playing me.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
Presidential action is in full swing with multiple town hall debates taking place between Republicans and Democrats last night and tonight. Here to break it all down for us is correspondent Josh Feinblatt. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex.
So last night's town hall, how did Trump do? He's leading in South Carolina by a significant margin. How did he do last night?
Well, he was on MSNBC, and to be honest, he didn't really have much of a ratings, and he didn't have many questions that were anything of significance. So I think viewers will really be looking for tonight, to see what he has to say.
And another person who's been talked about as someone who could do very well in South Carolina is Ted Cruz. There's a recent Wall Street Journal poll that shows him actually beating Trump nationwide. How did he do last night?
He actually did pretty well. He spent a lot of time actually talking about Donald Trump and the defamation lawsuit that Trump has threatened against Cruz. But he was able to reinforce, because of it, his Planned Parenthood stance. And then he also spoke about Cuba, and he said that in regards to dealing with Cuba, he wouldn't deal with anybody who had a Castro last name. And then he also just really reinforced a lot of what he had to say before, such as that he was going to repeal everything, every executive action that he thought was illegal from President Barack Obama in his first day in office.
Now, probably the candidate who most needs a strong performance in South Carolina after a very disappointing run in New Hampshire is Senator Marco Rubio. What did he look like last night?
He didn't do too bad. He covered a wide range of topics. Some of those included immigration, which he said he wanted to build some fences and monitor who is entering and exiting the country. He also talked about Cuba and said that he would deal with Cuba as long as Cuba was willing to negotiate and work with him. And then he also talked about racism, which was very interesting because he did say that police are very important, which we all know, but he also said that he knows that there are issues in a lot of communities, and he also said that he knows that black people get pulled over more than white people, which was very surprising. And then also he talked a little bit about his economic plans, which we hadn't heard much of before. He said he'd lower corporate tax rates to 25%. He said he'd reduce federal regulations and also to cut the national debt. He said he would cut some health care services, not anything Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, but some healthcare stuff.
Tonight's town hall, we've got John Kasich, Jeb Bush, and Donald Trump. What are you looking for tonight? Well,
it's going to be really interesting because a lot of them can use this as a jumping off point because they had such different results in Iowa and New Hampshire. So a good performance here can really help them. I mean, we should look for Trump to attack Rubio and Cruz because they both attacked him last night. We should look for Jeb Bush to attack Donald Trump because Donald Trump has been talking about his brother's presidency, and also Jeb Bush to talk about his South Carolina family ties. And then Kasich, this is one of his first times that he can actually speak without being interrupted. Because he didn't really have that much of a platform before, but after his New Hampshire win, he's going to have a good amount of time to actually let people know how he feels about things.
Josh, thank you for joining us. The South Carolina primaries and Nevada caucuses are coming in the next few days for both Democrat and Republican candidates. Here to give you a preview is Talking Points correspondent Topher Lane. Topher, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So looking first at South Carolina for the Republicans, who has the upper hand right now?
Currently, Trump is ahead in the polls by a wide margin, and it's looking like he shouldn't have much trouble in the primary. It's possible that Cruz could creep up on him, but otherwise most of the candidates are looking pretty invisible right now. They're all pretty low in high teens, even lower than that for some of them.
Now, with the exception of 2012, when Newt Gingrich won it, South Carolina has historically been very good at predicting the Republican nominee. How important is South Carolina to each candidate running right now?
It's very important for each candidate, and especially in different ways. Marco Rubio, for instance, is really looking for a big win after struggling in Iowa and New Hampshire. We've got Trump, who's really trying to make a point after struggling in Iowa and then coming out well in New Hampshire. He wants to really establish that a real candidate for South Carolina. And then you've got Cruz, who is also starting to look forward in national polls, and he wants to really make his way through and push through this primary.
Now, you mentioned that Rubio needs a big win. He just got a big endorsement. Nikki Haley, the very popular Rising Star governor of South Carolina, endorsed him. How much is that going to help him, do you think, in this election?
It should help him a lot. He also got an endorsement from the senator of South Carolina, Tim Scott, and that was a big endorsement for him as well. You would think that would up his numbers a lot. The polls that came out had Rubio in third place with 14% of the vote compared to Trump's 38 and Cruz's 22. So obviously he's hoping that will leapfrog him over Cruz and could possibly give him a chance at beating Trump, but it's really difficult to say. The polls that came out on Tuesday seem very one-sided for Trump. Rubio obviously hoping that these endorsements will help him out.
And shifting over to the Democratic side, they've got the Nevada caucuses coming up this Saturday. Who's in better shape there right now?
Well, both on Saturday night. Right now, it's very close to a tie. Polls say 48% Clinton, 47% Sanders, very similar to Iowa that we saw previously in the month. I would say Sanders right now has the momentum coming his way after the big win in New Hampshire and the close matchup in Iowa that really no one was expecting, I don't think. So I would say Sanders probably is looking better for this caucus, but it's hard to say.
Now, the polls, you said the polls have tightened recently. Hillary was leading not too long ago by more than 20, more than 30 in Nevada. What explains the tightening of these polls?
Part of it is the infrequency of the polling. We hadn't seen a poll come out in, I believe, over a month. And so people were looking at it saying Hillary has a 20-point lead, and then poll comes out a month and a half later and you see that it's actually close to tied. So the infrequency really makes it difficult to say how close it actually is, because I mean voters have swayed so significantly because of the primaries and the caucuses that Sanders has been much more effective in than people thought he would be, and I think that's swaying voters.
We'll see how it turns out. Topher, thank you for joining us. That's all the time we have for Talking Points this evening. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to check us out on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as our Talking Points blog. I'm Alex Amico. Good night, Syracuse.